In 1227, an old man lay dying in Qingshui County in China's northwest. Before him, the Western Xia Kingdom, about to be annihilated. Behind him, an empire stretching from the Mongolian steppe to the edge of Europe. 60 years earlier, he was a 9-year-old boy watching his father die of poison, abandoned by his own people, left to fend for himself on the open grassland. No one could have predicted that this discarded orphan would make Genghis Khan synonymous with the largest contiguous land empire in human history. The man European chronicles would call the Scourge of God. This is not a hero's epic. This is a record of revenge, political calculation, and institutional invention. The question we are asking is simple. How did a child abandoned by everyone end up redrawing the political map of an entire continent? Temujin was born into the Borgigian aristocracy. His father, Yasuge, was a tribal chief. Fate showed its cruelty early. On the journey home from arranging Temujin's betrothal, Yasuge was poisoned by the rival Merkit tribe. The logic of the steppe was unsentimental. A family without a powerful protector was worthless. The moment Yasuge died, the tribe abandoned his widow, Hoelin, and her young children to survive on their own. The boy Temujin and his brothers lived off wild roots and fish, and in a dispute over a single fish, Temujin killed his own half-brother, Begter. This is the first recorded act of violence in his life. It shaped the political logic that would define everything that followed. On the steppe, there is no permanent kindness, only permanent interest and permanent threat. As a young man, Temujin formed a blood brotherhood with Jamuka, Onda, sworn brothers, sharing food and shelter. That friendship would later end in the bloodiest possible way. But at the time, it was the first foundation stone of Temujin's rebuilt power. Temujin's rise was never a smooth ascent. It was a string of near-fatal defeats, paired with an extraordinary capacity for political recovery. The kidnapping of his wife was the first real test. Shortly after his marriage, his wife Borte was abducted by the Merkit. This was not just personal humiliation, it was a direct challenge to his authority. A leader who could not protect his own wife had no claim to lead anyone. Temujin allied with his blood brother Jamuka and with Togrul Khan, the most powerful chief on the steppe, and the three forces together recovered Borte. Soon after, Borte gave birth to a son, Joki, a name that means guest in Mongolian, a quiet admission of the doubts steppe nobles held about his bloodline. Yet Temujin never publicly denied Joki's right of inheritance. That single detail reveals something essential. He valued political stability over personal grievance every time. More importantly, this campaign proved his military talent for the first time. Coordinating allied forces, dividing the spoils, maintaining alliances after victory. It was the first real rehearsal for the empire he would later build. The Battle of the 13 Wings was an outright defeat and an accidental political triumph. Temujin's alliance with Jamuka eventually broke down over competition for resources, and the two former brothers went to war. On the battlefield, Temujin lost, forced to retreat in 13 divisions. But Jamuka's treatment of the prisoners after victory was a catastrophic political error. He had Temujin's captured men boiled alive in cauldrons. In the political culture of the steppe, this was a dangerously revealing signal. It told every potential ally that Jamuka was not a man worth trusting with your life. Tribes that had been neutral, or even leaning toward Jamuka, defected to Temujin's side overnight. This is a rule that repeats throughout steppe history. The victor on the battlefield is not always the victor in politics. Cruelty can win a battle. It will lose you the loyalty of an entire steppe. Eliminating his enemies, one by one, was the real project of unification. Over nearly 2 decades, Temujin defeated and absorbed the Tatars, the tribe responsible for his father's poisoning, the Kharite, the tribe of his own adoptive father Togrul Khan, and finally the Nayman, the last power on the steppe capable of challenging him. In every conquest, Temujin did not simply slaughter or expel the defeated. He absorbed their elites into his own system of rule, a pattern consistent with the logic he would later apply to governing an empire. In 1206, on the banks of the Onan River, Temujin convened a Kurultai, the supreme council of the Mongol tribes, and was proclaimed Genghis Khan. For the first time in steppe history, a genuinely unified political authority existed. Genghis Khan's true historical contribution was never the number of battles he won. It was that he redesigned the underlying logic of steppe politics, an institutional project whose consequences outlasted any single campaign. The Great Jasa, his code of law, was the first written legal system to replace centuries of blood-feud tradition. Before it, conflicts between tribes spiraled into endless cycles of revenge. You take my cattle, I kill your kin, and the grudge passes to the next generation. The Jasa established a single legal authority, welding scattered tribes into one entity bound by the same rules. The decimal system, organizing society into units of 10, 100, 1,000 households, was an even more revolutionary break. Genghis Khan shattered the old structure of clan and bloodline entirely, reassigning every person into this new military administrative grid. Loyalty no longer flowed to the chief of your birth clan, it flowed to the machine itself. This single reform solved the structural disease that had doomed nomadic powers for centuries: clan infighting. Countless steppe empires before his had collapsed from internal rivalry among aristocratic clans. The decimal system, by dismantling bloodline and rebuilding the chain of loyalty, gave the Mongol Empire a stability no steppe power had ever possessed. The creation of a Mongolian script showed the same institutional foresight. After defeating the Naiman, Genghis Khan captured their sealkeeper, Tatatunga, and ordered him to record the Mongolian language using the Uyghur alphabet. For the first time, the Mongols had a writing system and an administrative memory. Decrees, taxes, and military orders could now be transmitted precisely and preserved permanently, instead of relying on oral memory alone. A legal code, a military administrative grid, a writing system. Together, these three inventions formed the real foundation that let the Mongol Empire endure, rather than flare out, as so many steppe powers before it had. Having unified the steppe, Genghis Khan turned toward a far more complex adversary. Not another nomadic tribe, but the entire imperial order of China itself. The outcome of this confrontation would rewrite Chinese history altogether. This would not be another story of a northern people seizing half the realm. This would be the opening chapter of China's first complete conquest by a foreign power. Yahuling, the battle that decided North China's fate. In 1211, the Jin dynasty massed its forces at Yahuling in the mountainous terrain of Hebei, hoping to halt the Mongol advance. By every measure of geography, this should have been a defensive battle the Jin could win. Treacherous terrain, an army numbering in the hundreds of thousands, the kind of ground that should have neutralized Mongol cavalry mobility. But Genghis Khan identified the Jin's fatal weakness, a command structure in disarray, with no real coordination between divisions. The Mongols struck with overwhelming concentrated force, virtually annihilating the Jin's main army. The strategic significance went far beyond the battlefield. It destroyed the Jin's capacity to ever again field a force capable of standing against the Mongols in open battle. The unintended legacy of Western Liao, Yelu Dashi's exile, paved the road west. To understand how the Mongols were later able to achieve a level of conquest unmatched by any previous nomadic power, we have to go back decades earlier, to a history that, at the time, seemed to have nothing to do with the Mongols at all: the fall of the Khitan Liao dynasty. In 1125, the Liao collapsed under attack from the Jin. A member of the Liao imperial clan, Yelu Dashi, refused to surrender. He led his remaining forces west, eventually establishing a new state in Central Asia known as the Western Liao, or Kara Khitai. It was an act of desperate flight. Yelu Dashi and his followers simply wanted a place where the remnants of the Khitan royal house could survive after losing their homeland. They could never have known that this forced migration would, nearly a century later, open a direct strategic corridor into Central Asia for Genghis Khan. When the Mongol general Jebe conquered western Liao with a relatively small force, the Mongol Empire's territory extended into Central Asia for the first time, land that would become the launching ground for the first Mongol invasion of the West. The irony runs deep. The Jin destroyed the Liao to eliminate a threat. The fleeing remnant of the Liao royal house, without ever intending to, planted the geographic seed of the Jin's own eventual destruction. The technology pipeline, a channel that outlived 2 generations. The first Mongol invasion of the West against Khwarezmia brought more than territorial expansion. It opened a military engineering pipeline that would flow for decades. Central Asia and Persia had inherited a long Arab-Islamic engineering tradition, far more advanced in siege technology than anything the steppe itself possessed. As the Mongols conquered Khwarezmia, they began systematically recruiting Persian and Central Asian craftsmen and engineers into their armies, a transfer of technology and talent that would run for 2 or 3 generations and would bear its true fruit not in Genghis Khan's own lifetime, but in the hands of his grandsons. The clearest expression of this was the weapon later known as the Hui Pao, the Muslim trebuchet, or Xiangyang cannon. This counterweight siege engine, rooted in Persian and Arab engineering, far outmatched anything China had ever built. Between 1268 and 1273, Kublai Khan besieged Xiangyang and Fancheng, the southern Song's last great strategic barrier. It was the Persian engineers Ismail and Ala al-Din, recruited into Mongol service, who built the trebuchets that smashed a watchtower inside Xiangyang's walls, the blow that shattered the city's defenses, and with them, the southern Song's last line of resistance. This pipeline's reach extended far beyond China. In 1256, Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu laid siege to Alamut, the mountain fortress of the Nizari Ismailis, built by Hassan-i-Sabah, the so-called Old Man of the Mountain. This stronghold, reputed to be impregnable, had stood unconquered for over a century. It fell under the relentless bombardment of siege engines. 2 years later, Hulagu turned the same weapons on Baghdad, capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the political and cultural heart of the Islamic world. The city fell, and with it, the Abbasid Caliphate came to an end. The same technology would later accompany Mongol armies into Eastern Europe and the Russian principalities. From Xiangyang to Alamut, from Baghdad to the cities of Eastern Europe, these sieges, scattered across an entire continent, share a single technological lineage. Its origin point was the corridor Genghis Khan opened during his first invasion of Khwarezmia. The man's own campaigns had long since ended, but the technological bloodline he opened kept flowing through his descendants' hands for 2 full generations, reshaping the very form of warfare across Eurasia. The fall of the Southern Song, a dynasty's fatal ally. The Jin finally collapsed under sustained Mongol pressure, but it was the conquest of the Southern Song that pushed history in a direction with no precedent, a conquest that would, for the first time, place the entirety of China under complete foreign rule. The Southern Song possessed considerable economic strength, advanced firearms technology, and the natural barrier of the Yangtze River, a geographic shield that had repeatedly protected Southern regimes from Northern conquest throughout Chinese history. Had the Song shown strategic resolve to match its resources, this war might not have ended in total collapse. Instead, the late Southern Song's political decisions were marked by a string of catastrophic failures. Chancellor Jia Sidao, during the critical phase of the siege of Xiangyang, concealed frontline reports and delayed reinforcements, a decision that ultimately allowed this strategic fortress on the Middle Yangtze to fall. Once Xiangyang was lost, the entire defensive line behind it lay open. Jia Sidao then rushed into the disastrous battle of Dingjiazhou, where the Song's last main army was almost entirely destroyed. In 1279, after the naval battle of Yamen, the Southern Song fell completely. This was the first time in Chinese history that an entire dynasty had been conquered in its entirety by a foreign power. Not the familiar pattern of north-south division or half the realm, but the total absorption of every region, from the Yellow River to the Pearl River, from the western frontier to the eastern sea, under a single nomadic-founded dynasty. History's most haunting moments are rarely the inevitable ones. They are the moments when one specific person, in one specific instant, made a decision that seemed trivial at the time, and that decision rewrote the fate of an entire continent. In 1218, Genghis Khan had already unified Mongolia and destroyed western Liao. His attention turned towards Central Asia, but at this point he had no concrete plan to conquer Khwarezmia. His opening posture was, if anything, cautious and restrained. What he wanted was a profitable trade route, not a war. The greed of Otrar, a border governor's fatal choice. Genghis Khan dispatched a caravan of roughly 450 merchants to Khwarezmia, carrying enormous quantities of gold, silk, and furs. A high-level diplomatic and commercial overture intended to establish a long-term trading relationship. The caravan reached Otrar, a border city in what is now Kazakhstan. The city's governor, Inalchuk, was a trusted relative of the Khwarezmian Sultan's mother's clan, well-connected and notoriously arrogant. Coveting the caravan's enormous wealth, Inalchuk accused the merchants of espionage, seized them, and ordered the execution of more than 400 people. Only a single camel driver escaped to carry the news back to the Mongols. Every item of the caravan's wealth was claimed by Inalchuk himself. This was an act of pure local greed, with no deeper strategic calculation behind it whatsoever. A border governor, tempted by the wealth in front of him, chose mass murder. The Sultan's indulgence, the last window closes. When news of the massacre reached Genghis Khan, his response remained remarkably restrained. He did not immediately go to war. Instead, he sent a second delegation, this time a formal diplomatic mission, directly to the court of Sultan Muhammad, ruler of Khwarezmia, demanding that Inalchuk be handed over for punishment, in hope of resolving the matter peacefully. This should have been history's turning point, a window through which the entire coming catastrophe might have been avoided. Had Muhammad simply been willing to discipline one border governor and draw a clear line of responsibility, the conflict could very plausibly have ended there. Instead, Muhammad made the opposite choice. Not only did he refuse to surrender Inalchuk, he had the senior Mongol envoy executed and had the junior envoy's beard shaved off before expelling him. In the diplomatic customs of both the Steppe and Central Asia, this was an act of extreme, deliberate humiliation. Why did Muhammad choose this path? Some historical analysis suggests he had grossly overestimated his own military strength. Khwarezmia commanded an army said to number in the hundreds of thousands, with territory spanning from Central Asia to Persia. He may have had no real understanding of what he was rejecting, a newly forged power that had just unified the entire Mongol steppe with stunning efficiency and had already demonstrated a capacity for military organization of unprecedented destructive force. Inalchuk's greed, Muhammad's arrogance and miscalculation. A border governor and a sultan, at 2 points not far apart in time, each made the choice that pushed the conflict past the point of no return. For Genghis Khan, this was no longer a commercial dispute. It was a double humiliation of the Mongol Empire's collective dignity, a massacred caravan, an executed envoy. In the political logic of the steppe, this was an insult that could only be answered with war. In 1219, Genghis Khan personally led his armies west with one target, Khwarezmia. Annihilation, a textbook destruction. The destructive force of this campaign exceeded anything Khwarezmia could have imagined. The Mongol armies demonstrated extraordinary strategic mobility, splitting into multiple columns, crossing desert terrain thought to be impassable, and launching nearly simultaneous assaults on Khwarezmia's major cities. Otrar fell first, after months of siege. Inalchuk himself was captured, according to one account, executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears, a grim answer to the greed that had started the entire war. Bukhara and Samarkand, two of the most magnificent centers of learning and commerce in Central Asian civilization, fell one after another. Gurganj, the Khwarezmian capital, held out under prolonged siege before finally collapsing, the city devastated. Sultan Muhammad himself fled west under Mongol pursuit, drifting from place to place, and finally died of illness on a desolate island in the Caspian Sea, accompanied by only a handful of followers. A man who had once ruled vast stretches of Central Asia and Persia, ending his life with no kingdom to return to and no power left to resist. If not for Inalchuk. History cannot be rewritten, but this war leaves behind a what-if that is impossible to set aside. Had Inalchuk never massacred that caravan, had Muhammad chosen to surrender a single border governor to settle the matter, the Mongol Empire's strategic focus would likely have remained on China. The destruction of the Jin was already close to inevitable. The fate of the southern Song at that point in history was still genuinely uncertain. But the destruction of Khwarezmia fundamentally shifted the Mongol Empire's geographic center of gravity. For the first time, Mongol attention turned toward the far west, Persia, the Caucasus, the steppes of Eastern Europe. It was this corridor, opened jointly by Inalchuk and Muhammad, that paved the way for the second and third Mongol invasions of the West. Campaigns that would eventually bring Mongol cavalry to the borders of Russia, Poland, and Hungary, and shake the whole of Europe to its core. European historians have often looked back on this episode with a kind of fatalistic resignation. Had the governor of Otrar not coveted that caravan's wealth, had Sultan Muhammad's arrogance been tempered even slightly, Europe might never have witnessed the arrival of the Scourge of God. But history has no if. It records only this. The greed of one border governor and the arrogance of one sultan somehow drew an entire continent into a catastrophe that neither man could have foreseen. In 1226, nearly 60 years old, a remarkable age for the era, Genghis Khan insisted on personally leading a campaign against Western Shah. The reason? Western Shah had broken its alliance during the first Mongol invasion of the West, refusing to send troops in support. A betrayal Genghis Khan considered unforgivable. During the siege of Western Shah, Genghis Khan fell ill and died in Qingshui County. In his final moments, he ordered that the siege continue after his death until Western Shah was utterly destroyed. And so it was. But Genghis Khan's most consequential political legacy was, perhaps, not any single campaign. It was the arrangement he made for succession before he died. His eldest son Jochi and his second son Chagatai had a long and openly hostile rivalry. Historical records describe the two brothers brawling inside the royal tent in front of witnesses. This kind of fierce fraternal conflict was, for any steppe power, a danger capable of triggering civil war. Genghis Khan's solution was a masterstroke of political judgment. Rather than simply following the order of seniority, he chose his third son, Ogadai, even-tempered, skilled at mediating between his brothers, as his successor. At the same time, following the steppe tradition of the youngest son inheriting the family's core holdings, he left his own personal territory and elite forces to his youngest son, Tolui. This careful distribution of power and inheritance ensured that the Mongol Empire did not immediately collapse into a war of succession after Genghis Khan's death. Instead, under the relatively stable cooperation between Ogadai and Tolui's lineage, the empire continued expanding for decades, making possible the second and third invasions of the West, and ultimately pushing the Mongol Empire's territory to a scale unmatched in human history. Genghis Khan's life is often reduced to a pure record of conquest. Body counts, the scale of slaughter, the size of the territory seized. But if these are the only numbers we remember, we miss what matters most about this history. What truly distinguished the Mongol Empire from the countless steppe powers that flared and vanished before it was never Genghis Khan's personal military genius. It was the institutional legacy he left behind. A military administrative system that severed the grip of bloodline. A unified legal code that replaced blood feud. A writing system that let administrative memory survive him. And a carefully engineered succession that avoided the civil war so many empires never escaped. History does not judge whether a conqueror deserves admiration, but it keeps a precise record of one thing. It is institutions, not conquest itself, that determine how long an empire survives. This is Kong Su's history. In the long river of time, what we are searching for is the fragile, golden path toward freedom.